Hello and welcome to another member request video, a series where members, both on YouTube and Patreon, can request a short for me to take a look at, or even a TV series, as long as it's animated and as long as it's not Warner Brothers, since I'm covering all of those anyway. The selection for this member request video is for a Yogi Bear short, and the person requesting it said I could pick any one, so I figured, why not pick the first one? Because it's definitely interesting to see how Yogi Bear was when he first debuted compared to all the tropes that will be introduced later on, and everything gets standardized. So the first Yogi Bear short is Yogi Bear's Big Break, and that was part of the Huckleberry Hound Show in 1958, so during the first season and very first episode, and it's directed by Bill Hanna and Joe Barbera. Two names you should be very familiar with if you're a fan of Tom and Jerry. Now the good folks at Warner Archive, they finally released all the episodes of the Huckleberry Hound Show and put them together as best as they could, all the episodes as they originally aired. There's the odd thing here and there that they couldn't find, but it's still commendable that they were able to do what they did on this set. Now, in case you haven't seen this one, it's nothing deep, and none of these shorts were ever deep story-wise or just simple ideas. It was more the execution that's the entertaining part of these early Hanna-Barbera shorts. In case you haven't seen this one, Yogi's not happy with being essentially a kiddie tourist attraction and complains about kids saying, look at the bears, look at the bears. And he decides, you know what, I've had enough, I'm going to escape. And the rest of the short is about him trying to escape and all the twists and turns along the way. Again, nothing deep, nor does it need to be. So in terms of trivia, now of course I already mentioned this is the first Yogi Bear short, but for those who aren't aware, the Huckleberry Hound Show is where Yogi Bear debuted. So the Huckleberry Hound Show was the second Hanna-Barbera show. Their first one was Rough and Ready, and with the Huckleberry Hound Show, they would have 3 segments. The idea of an entire episode, if you will, so like a half-an-hour episode of something, was still a few years yet, so animation for television was still using the idea that they had to be shorts. So in the first 2 seasons of Huckleberry Hound, you would have Huckleberry Hound, of course, the main star, Yogi Bear, and Pixie and Dixie and Mr. Jinx. But Yogi Bear proved to be so popular that he actually spun off in his own show, The Yogi Bear Show, appropriately enough, and his segments in seasons 3 and 4 of the Huckleberry Hound Show, he was replaced by Hokey Wolf, for better or worse, of course. Now, one of the fascinating things about watching these really early Hanna-Barbera shorts, once Bill Hanna and Joe Barbera were fired from MGM and they created their own studio, and yes, I'm somewhat simplifying what actually happened, but essentially they opened up a studio. They had a lot of the ex-Golden Age animators working for them, and they created animated properties for television, which was becoming hugely popular, and that was one of the reasons why animated shorts for the cinema or the theater were being wound down. Yeah, there were still studios making shorts for the cinema or the theater, depending on what part of the world you are and what you call them, but a lot of places had shut down, and MGM was one of them. And what was happening on television at the time when it came to children's entertainment, they were showing a lot of the shorts that were originally run in the cinema or the theater. There was nothing really made for TV. But around this time, you had Crusader Rabbit, which is considered to be the first animated show specifically made for television, and Hanna-Barbera was not far behind with Rough and Ready and then Huckleberry Hound. And as you watch this short, you'll notice a few things, and I'll definitely point out some really interesting stuff here. First of all, Hanna-Barbera had to figure out a way on how to produce animation a lot cheaper, because a lot more had to be made for the television market, and so they had to work out how could they make a high quality product while slashing the cost. And one of the ways was, some might call it limited animation, some call it planned animation, where there's fewer drawings to emphasize the actual action. And you'll see plenty of that in this short, and you can tell here they're still figuring things out. If you go back and watch Rough and Ready, it's even more raw than this, where a lot of parts are barely animated at all. But they had to figure things out. No one had done any of this before, really, so it was uncharted territory. As you watch the Hanna-Barbera shows over the years, right up until the early 1960s, you'll see that they improve on things. You'll see that they figure out what shortcuts work best to make a high-quality product. Because the other thing they had to factor in was the fact that there was only black and white TV broadcasting when this was released. So the fact that they made it in color showed that they had foresight that color TV was inevitable. They could then continue having these episodes shown into the future, and they certainly did. They were then shown on Saturday mornings, and I personally saw these on Cartoon Network in the 90s. They're not really shown much these days, which I think is an absolute shame, but it is what it is. Now, you'll notice as well in this short, a few elements are not in place. Now, we all know Yogi Bear is all about stealing picnic baskets from the tourists, but that doesn't really happen here. It's just, again, the idea of him just trying to escape the park, and that's it. The whole picnic basket idea would come later on. They also don't establish Ranger Smith's look yet. He looks really different in this one compared to his later looks. In fact, they would alter his look quite a few times, all throughout the different properties of Yogi Bear. In fact, voice acting wise, it's a little different. So of course, the legendary Daws Butler, whom Hanna-Barbera worked with earlier over at MGM, he voices Yogi, but he also voices the Ranger here, and the Ranger's voice would later on be done by Don Messick. Don Messick is here. He does the narrator's voice, he does Boo Boo, plus a few other incidental characters. Again, this is all uncharted territory. They just made these shorts, they saw what worked, what didn't, but they could clearly see that there was something about the Yogi Bear character, because otherwise why do a spin-off show? And I'm glad they did, because without the Yogi Bear show in Spinoff, we wouldn't get Snagglepuss, and I really enjoy Snagglepuss. But let's take a look at this short from start to finish and go through a few things, a few observations, especially in relation to the limited animation and what they would do to try and show off a higher quality product with all the limitations. Now, some information does come from Don Yelp's blog, an excellent blog that details a lot of Hanna-Barbera animation history, among other things. And while the credits state Kenneth Muse, who was an animator that worked with Hanna-Barbera over at MGM. He's a sole animator here, but according to Don Yelp, Mike La, who was also over at MGM, did some work on this one uncredited. But this is more or less a one-man animated show, and it's always fascinating to see an entire short done either all or mostly by one person. And when it says directed by Bill Hanna and Joseph Barbera, they really meant it this time. Some later properties you would see their directing credits as though they actually did the directing when they actually didn't. And it'll be someone else actually doing the directing, like, say, Iwao Takamoto and so on. But no, earlier on, it was a smaller studio, and Hanna-Barbera were definitely hands-on with a lot of the work. So they were even involved with the actual recording of the voice actors for this. They certainly wanted to make sure that their studio succeeded. It was only later on, once the Taft Corporation, especially when they bought out Hanna-Barbera, that Bill Hanna and Joe Barbera weren't exactly as hands-on as they did in the very beginning. But that's another thing entirely. But we see the title card, Yogi Bear's Big Break, which is a very appropriate title in hindsight because, again, this character succeeded well enough to have the spin-off show. But we open up with the narrator, and we can see already some of the shortcuts with what they did to keep animation costs slow. The cars, for example, they're just standing still, and it's really just the backgrounds moving here. But it does the job, but I love the colors of the background. The layouts are done by Dick Bickenbach, again, someone else from MGM. And backgrounds are done by, I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, because I've never really known how to pronounce this, Monty Allegri. I hope I didn't butcher that. Maybe I did. I don't know. But regardless, the backgrounds are stunning. And that's one way that Hanna-Barbera were able to disguise the fact that, yes, the animation is very limited by having the other elements be incredibly strong so that you don't really pay too much attention that the animation is limited. Granted, when you watch this short, yes, you will notice a lot of very jerky moments of animation, so it definitely shows, but once they figure out the animation part of it and all the elements play well together, you really do forget that what you're watching is very limited. Just watch any Flintstones episode to give one example. So we're introduced to Jellystone, of course, a parody of Yellowstone. So we've already got that element all set up in our Yogi Bear universe there. So we see Yogi and Boo Boo. Of course, Yogi's not happy that he's just basically a tourist attraction, and he's complaining about it. Now, for those who aren't aware, one of the reasons a lot of the Hanna-Barbera designed characters have ties and collars is so that they don't have to animate the neck as much, and that saves a lot of time and money. So they would have the body just stay in one held pose, and then you can just move the head around, and of course animate the mouth for the dialogue. And it works really well, although this beginning bit is really jerky. But it's definitely amusing when you have Yogi tilt his head, eyes are open, and he's just talking all sarcastically, saying, "Look at the bears, look at the bears." even though this is all limited, the strong facial expressions definitely make up for a lot of the jerkiness of the animation. So Yogi decides he's just going to leave, and you can hear one of the best elements of the Hanna-Barbera projects, which are the sound effects. And you can hear it when Yogi Bear is more or less tiptoeing with both his hands and arms, trying to leave Jellystone Park. But the jig is up. The kids in the car say, "Look at the bear," and we can see that Yogi Bear is caught out. And the Rangers not having any of that, and so we're back to square one. So we've established our premise. Yogi's had enough and he just wants to leave. And that's just effective writing, full stop. So next up, Yogi tries something simple by simply hitching a ride in the back of someone's car. But you'll notice, and again, part of this is to save on money, so you don't have as much details, but everyone in the cars are all more or less silhouettes. Sure, it works for a cost-cutting measure, but it also works as a stylistic choice as well. But Yogi fails, and he's forced to get back into the park. Now, the next bit was kind of a weird one. I mean, part of it, maybe the joke wasn't as set up as well as it perhaps could have been, but it's fine. I'm sure the kids watching this certainly wouldn't have minded back in the 50s, but you see someone in the actual caravan doing something, cooking, washing dishes, whatever. We all know it's Yogi, but there's nothing to make Ranger Smith realize, oh wait, that's actually Yogi in disguise. Come back here. So the joke could have been done better, but you move on, especially if you've seen the rest of the short and how great a lot of the actual gags are. But I gotta say, Yogi Bear in that disguise is quite amusing, but you do have to wonder if Yogi Bear actually mauled the woman who originally wore that. See, that pretty much takes a dark turn, doesn't it? So next up, a mild-mannered looking man is trying to drive out of the park, and Yogi looks like he's dead on the back, as though this person had shot Yogi. So here the gag is set up a little bit better, where Ranger thinks, oh yeah, the bear has been shot. No, I didn't shoot the bear. Oh, I see. And Ranger decides to test out if Yogi really dead and ends up poking him with a giant needle. So a few things here. I do like Yogi breaking the fourth wall, smiling at us. Look at me, I'm going to get away with this, just for a brief moment. But Hanna-Barbera shows they're definitely some of the masters of off-screen action, because you don't really need to animate any of this, because we don't actually see the needle poking Yogi. We just hear the sound effects off the side, and we imagine it being quite gruesome, and we get a bit of animation, which is perhaps the most fully animated part of this, even though it's still quite limited, and that's Yogi running away with his butt all hurt. But if you look closely, there's no actual legs, it's just the swirls. So a lot of the time, the animators around this time would actually, instead of animating a proper run, they would just make it as though the character has wheels as they're running away really, really fast. But the face looks more fully animated too, when Yogi's screaming in pain. So I guess with some of the Golden Age animators, some of the older habits have still stayed with them, because they were the masters of what they were doing when they were doing full animation, so something like this would have been more or less a walk in the park for them. But now we get into some quick gag territory, which is simply Yogi trying to escape, but not via the Ranger's office, which is probably something he should have tried earlier on. But he first tries to pole vault over the actual fence, but the stick ends up falling into a gopher hole. You do have to wonder though, why didn't you just try again and just make sure there was no gopher hole? Because this looks like something that would have worked. But in any case, we go on to the next part where Boo Boo explains the plan to the people, even though the map should have been self-explanatory. But again, I love this moment when you see Yogi's digging the tunnel. Look at the designs of the rocks in the background. It's just so stylistic. And imagine watching this on a black and white TV set too. It still would have played really well. Although I'm really glad that we can see it in its full color glory. But again, look at the legs. They're just smears, as we see Yogi digging through. But once again, we don't see Yogi popping through the ground per se. We just see him push Ranger Smith through the ceiling, and yeah, their expressions definitely say it all. But what's interesting is the next bit, where unlike something like, say, the Wile E. Coyote series, where the coyote would just try something once and not try it again, even if it's a genuinely decent idea, so Yogi tries to use a tree to essentially fling himself over the wall. Again, he could have tried the pole vaulting thing again, but in any case, tries multiple times at least. The first time, he just smashes straight into the ground. Beautiful. And again, the sound effects definitely help with the fact that it's very limited animation. So they try again, but Yogi ends up just flying through and ends up hitting the tree. But if you look at the split moment before he hits the tree, there's just two drawings there, done very quickly. So you have the one drawing of him in midair, just before the tree, and literally the next drawing is him smashed into the tree. So there's no in-betweens, nothing. And if you freeze frame a lot of this short, for whatever reason, maybe if you're a budding animation student, you can definitely notice a lot of that happening, where it's just literally going from one major pose to another with very little, or in this case, no in-betweens at all. So maybe third time's the charm, and what do you know? Yogi's actually successful and even has the parachute, so he's definitely a well-prepared bear. Oh, and you don't actually hear his trademark saying smarter than the average bear in this short, because again, they're still figuring everything out. But what a nice payoff. He lands into a truck that says park maintenance and ends up being taken back into the park. But we get our final attempt to breach the wall, which involves Yogi using some blasting powder and essentially making a makeshift cannon of sorts. Now you do hear the line, "and away I go." That was what Jackie Gleason would say, and it's interesting that later on when the Flintstones come out, it was essentially the Honeymooners. But if you look at this scene as well, first of all, you do hear a lot of Yogi's dialogue off screen. And again, another great cost-cutting measure where you can have part of the conversation not animated and just heard, and it does the job. But once again, if you look at Yogi's poses once he puts on the helmet, there's no in-betweens. He just points in a lot of different directions while he's talking and does one big pose saying, "and away I go." And we don't even see him get in the cannon either. He's just in the next shot already in the cannon. Again, a wonderful way to keep the costs down. But we get a wonderful twist here. So Ranger Smith sees Boo Boo, says lucky for Yogi, he's actually in the park because it's hunting season. And we see the cannon actually works. And again, what's interesting is that we see Yogi very briefly in the air and he just lands somewhere. We just hear the sound effects. We don't even see the impact of landing, nothing. We just see the beautiful backgrounds here and a few bits of light when all the gunshots are happening. So we finish up with another twist, that the gates close at 6 p.m. and Yogi is now trapped outside. Presumably, he'll end up getting hunted, and that's that. So that was the first ever Yogi Bear short, and yeah, it is quite raw for all the reasons I've already gone through, and a lot of the elements that we all know and love about Yogi Bear, about the picnic baskets and so on, that haven't even come into play yet. But honestly, for what it is, I think it's funny. Either the funniest thing ever made? No, but it's definitely a fascinating bit of curio to see just what they were doing in the early days of animation on television to try and make it work as they transitioned from the theatricals over to television. In terms of rating, look, 8 out of 10. It's not my favorite Yogi. There are definitely other ones that I very much prefer, but for what it is, it's a fine intro. And I can see why people would have enjoyed Yogi to the point where he became so popular he had his own spin-off show. So there's that. But that'll do it for this one. Thank you so much for watching, guys. And if you want to request a review, you just need to become a YouTube or Patreon member and I might take a look at your suggestion. But until next time, guys, take care.
Hey, open up! It's me, Yogi Boy! Let me in! Open up! Only been gone 2 minutes and I'm homesick for the park already! Open up!